Hey everyone, I just wanted to go over a few like bonus little bits about using reference and doing some thumbnail stuff because I think when I was going around on Thursday's session, there's a few people who had the same sort of questions about doing some of the thumbnails and the early iteration stages. Now, like I said to you guys before, I'm going to put up the video that I'm doing. This character is currently for one of the third year modules, but I'll put the video up once it's all finished. It's kind of in the same sort of timeline as what you guys are doing with your 16th and 19th century sort of art style, historical context sort of stuff. And I just want to just go about explaining how I use reference personally and what I get from it. So one of the ways I like to do things is if I'm designing something new is have the reference at the side here. Now this is obviously kind of a limited reference. So what I've got is a couple of different clothing from different historical time periods, and then just as a point of reference, I've got one from the Order 1866, I think it was, and Dishonored 2, just to kind of see how other people have made some changes. Now, I wouldn't always recommend having other game references as your primary source of research. It can be useful to see what other people have been doing, but not necessarily have that as your main focus. You kind of want to make those choices yourself. You want to put it through your own filter. So they're kind of useful to have on the side, or maybe just around. But primarily, you're looking at this kind of stuff. Now, one of the reasons of using a reference like this is because you can't be expected to know exactly what everything looks like. So if I said 16th to 19th century, or that was your basic cultural influences that for your design, like off the top of your head, it's kind of difficult to know what those things look like. I mean, if I was to say, particularly if it was focused in on, say, we're going to do 16th century only, like the difference between a 16th century and a 17th century, those are the kind of things you'd have to understand. But also, it's just good to have little design elements in there that you might not necessarily thought of if you want to exclude all references. Now, some people like to work by not having any references to start with when they're doing the initial thumbnails, and that's absolutely fine too if you're just looking for shapes and stuff like that. But if you do get to the point where you're kind of making the same choices or going over the same things again, this is where your reference can be useful. Now, what I'm not doing is what I've seen a couple of you do here and there, is I'm not taking wholesale from my reference and combining it with different elements. So for example, I'm not taking this jacket here. I'm going to put a layer, help if I'm on the actual pencil. I'm not taking this one here and then putting it with these trousers here, for example. What I am looking for is I'm looking for shapes. I'm looking for things that are interesting. So I'm looking for the flow of this jacket. I like the way this jacket hangs. So it's this kind of shape that I'm looking for, and it's this kind of also where you've got this cut off here, how these trousers are, where they are placed on the body, how they sort of fit together with the jacket. You've got different types of sleeves here, so you've got some sleeves which bow out more, and you've got the ruffled sleeves and stuff like that, and you've got a cape which connects interestingly, or you've got the opposite. You've got these kind of fitted sleeves that run down here, and those are the kind of choices you want to make when you're doing your initial thumbnail. So if I just quickly pop up the ones that I did here, now, well, actually started this side, so I flipped it over, but so this is kind of like almost like the progression of the basic design goes from this way to this way. And I think what a lot of people do, and I mean I've been as guilty as this as anybody, is actually not changing up the way you work. So if you remember when we were talking about initial starting points and thumbnails and stuff like that, I was kind of talking about using something like a hard round brush on a lower opacity and a bigger brush to sort of like block in shapes like this, and sort of like, okay, when I'm actually looking at the flow of this thing here, looking at the light and shade, and trying to like carve forms out of it like this. So you go, well, there be my head. So once you want to start painting this in, and this is like something on the neck. So let's start painting the shadow in like this, and that way you kind of build up form and build up sort of interesting shapes and things like that, without focusing too much on the actual design elements of the character. You can then start putting that stuff in later. This is kind of like focusing a little bit on your, I don't know what this guy's going to have. He's not the same guy, but let's give him like a weapon of some kind. He's not the, I'm not looking at each individual design element of this. I'm just thinking about how the pose fits together. It's almost like focusing on both your silhouette and your design elements at the same sort of time. And so you can get away with doing stuff like that quite nicely. It actually looks like he's maybe it looks like a hockey player. There we go. Some sort of post-apocalyptic hockey player or something like that, I don't know. But that's the basic idea. So the forms, I'm looking for the forms, I'm looking for the shapes, I'm looking for how things fit together, and ultimately focusing a little bit on the pose as well. And then obviously when you go in, you can start refining things that you see out of this kind of method by like painting in. It looks like he's got some big, I don't know, armor around here, so actually maybe want to exaggerate that form a little bit. Going into it like this, or doing stuff like this, which is all great. I mean, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Obviously, I'm not thinking too much about the anatomy, I'm not thinking too much about proportions yet. Like, that's the kind of thing when you go in and paint it and you can refine it, you can do that. Which is actually the way I started out with these ones. But what was happening is, so from the start with these ones here, this one and this one, I was just taking too long to do them, and I wasn't kind of getting the clarity that I wanted. Particularly with a design like this, which is kind of mainly costume based, and it's going to be quite an intricate costume because of the kind of character I wanted to go for. So I actually changed up the way I worked. So rather than working that, I worked into line work and started putting flat colours underneath to get that graphic read that we spoke about in there as well. And that's absolutely fine to do. So, if you are getting stuck with one particular way of working, don't be afraid to change it up. Don't be afraid to go from line work to painting, from painting back to line work, using your bigger brush, smaller brush, whatever kind of helps you get the idea out. But if one method is tripping you up, make sure you can, vary things up. It's worth learning a few different techniques in case that happens. So the other thing I wanted to cover real quickly is about the process of doing this with the line work. So I want to show you really quickly what I'm thinking and how I'm doing it. Now, one of the main things that you need to remember about doing this kind of stuff is that you've got to keep your character in mind at all times. Who they are, what they are to your world, where they're sort of placed. And obviously I've given you the bare bones. I've given you some basic descriptors, whether or not you've got Gaspard or Felix or Francesca or whatever. The basic idea of those has been given to you, but you kind of have to flesh out yourself for the rest of it. And one of the difficult things about doing stuff like projects for yourself or projects for university is that you have to be your own art director. Now, if you were doing something for an industry or for a client, there'd be lots of other things that would be vital to the project. Like the story would be maybe not fully fleshed out, but you'd have an idea of who they are in the story. You'd have an idea of maybe some of the gameplay mechanics, and some of those things would feed into your character design. Have to think about your camera angle, right? If it's going to be a third person over the shoulder shooter kind of game, you couldn't have a character with big bulky backpacks and stuff that would block the camera view and stuff like that. So that kind of thing would impact on your design. But when you're doing it from the point of view of a personal project, or a university project or whatever it might have been, or something for school, it's like you need to think a little bit about those kind of things yourself, and you have to make those decisions yourself. And the difficult thing about doing that is ultimately you are sort of your own art director, which can lead to, well, I just wanted to do this, or making up excuses later. So you have to be a little bit disciplined with yourself, and also imagining yourself a little bit like you're someone's in the next step of the pipeline. So like I say, again, you're not going to have 3D modelers waiting on these sheets for you, but having those kind of things in mind, like would they be able to make this, would this work as a silhouette, does this work as a character, would this be really technically challenging to do, can be worth keeping in mind. So let's sketch up a quick character here in the way that I've been doing it for these previous thumbnails, okay? And then I'll go through the quick process of iteration and stuff I do that. So what I'm starting off with when I'm doing these is actually I'm not really starting off with anything, so just kind of plotting in the head, because obviously I know where the head is going to be. Head is always going to be the same size. I know it's going to be human. I know it's going to be correct sort of realistic, semi-realistic proportions. Again, we're going to keep it within the same realm of the brief, so just starting with sketching ahead, and this is where I'm starting to look for interesting shapes. Again, I'm not taking wholesale from any of these things. I'm looking for the interesting shapes. So what I kind of like is I like this kind of X shape, the way this thing attaches. So let's say I want to get this kind of a shape in. So I want to have a collar that maybe goes up like this and then flows down and sticks out a little bit from the guy's chest like this. So I'm not going to have that on this side, but maybe I'm going to have this kind of, so I'm introducing a different kind of collar. So rather than having it turned up like that, maybe I want to have something that goes down like this collar does here. Like this, okay? So let's quickly plot where his arm is going to be. Let's have it, so, well, I need to bring this in a little bit if it's going to connect in front of his chest. Try and think about my centre line here. It's going to come down a little bit like this. And maybe stick out to the side. Now it's quite aggressive. I'm going to stick out so much. I'm going to roughly plot his arm in. Now, it can be useful as well if you're doing these particular designs. You want to try and pick a pose which shows enough of the design, but maybe gets a little bit of the character across as well. in your design. Because remember, with character designs, you're not just designing costumes. There's not just pure costume design. There is an element of designing the character and the personality in there as well, particularly for a project like the ones you're doing in currently in the class. So at this point, I mean, I'm kind of talking and doing it at the same time. I wouldn't usually use the eraser at all at this point. That comes a little bit later down the line. So let's plot on his chest. And I think this coat is going to go out his shoulder there. So I'm just going to give him... So I wanted to give him a pistol. I have got like a rough backstory in my mind for this guy to help me design this, but I'm not going to go into it too much. But he's supposed to be sort of like a leader, almost like cult leader or faction leader, who's not particularly... He's not a nice guy, but he's not overly violent or anything like that. But he's also not... He does have a pistol. He has his pistol that it's just like his personal sidearm, but he's not particularly like a fighter, aggressive kind of person. He just, you know... I don't know how to describe it really. Shoots people in interrogations if they annoy him. You know, that kind of a character. He's not particularly nice. So I want to get this sense of, buttoned up feeling to him. I want to get this sort of sense that he's not a nice character, but he's also like a high class sort of, or a higher class kind of guy, and like a nasty piece of work who's maybe got some power. So that's the kind of vibe I'm going for. So now, I get this jacket going in together, which I quite like, but I also like this kind of stuff from these outfits here with the cool waistcoat sort of thing. Now, obviously in the back of my mind, as I'm doing any of this stuff, I'm thinking about the shape language. I'm thinking about trying to get these sort of like interesting flows in. So, I could go for a triangular shape design. So I want to kind of think about that a little bit as I'm designing. It is mainly just clothes, but maybe we want to have some sort of other coat that comes down a little bit further. So if we want to double up the waistcoat. So this is where I start twisting the design a little bit like you've got down here with the seams, right? So the Dishonored one, it's kind of got the same sort of vibe to it, like having a jacket and a waistcoat, but they've twisted the seams. So rather have the seam straight down on a jacket like this, the seam's actually like to the side like this, and this gives it enough visual interest. You've got the hood coming up like this, and it's attached like that. So that gives enough visual interest to look different than your standard thing. So that's what the kind of things I'm trying to get in. So let's put him holding his gun. Now what you'll notice is I'm really not being too careful about any of this. I'm not looking for good drawings. I'm not looking for perfect anatomy. I'm not looking for perfect proportions. That kind of stuff can come later. Initially it's just the sort of getting the idea out there like this. So maybe he's got some... What I'm going to do for the trousers, so you can either have trousers like this, with a little that sort of more slimline thing, or I can maybe get some of these things in, these like half trousers. But let's try and change them up a little bit. So let's have them a little bit further down. Might look a little bit derpy, but let's try it. So it might be over his knees. And he's got his... Actually, let's give him some higher boots than just the toe shoes, or not toe shoes. What am I talking about? The shoes that are a little bit sort of just normal shoes. Just normal. So I'm trying to talk and draw at the same time, which means I'll probably babble and say some ridiculous stuff. All right, so I'm starting to get an idea of who this character is, what they look like. So again, I'm looking for the flow of this jacket. I'm not really happy with it. It hasn't got that kind of sweeping curve that I want. And again, so I'm looking at this one for reference at the moment, just the way this thing sweeps down. So I'm trying to get that into my jacket as well. Let's do... Maybe it's got some sort of tie thing here to tie his trousers on. Not particularly happy with that, but it's okay because it's a thumbnail. So, like you can see already, from the point of view of anatomy, like I've made him very, very tall for the size of his head. But that's no issue. Like I said, I'm not worried too much about the anatomy at this point. So really just kind of focusing on those things. Maybe let's give him, because I also wanted, obviously, because he's got his pistol. So maybe let's give him a belt, because I have done that a couple of times with these ones here. So that would cinch in the jacket a little bit, would change the form of how this thing would fall. So it wouldn't flare so much out that way, but it would come out here. So he's wearing on the outside of his jacket. He's got his pistol holster here on the side. Maybe his shirt comes to here as well. So he's got his belt buckle there. I mean, all this stuff is usually wouldn't be showing anybody this stuff because it's just supposed to be for me, because it is kind of, you know, messy and weird. And obviously now what I've starting to get happening is the fact that he's got very long torso, which I do not want. Let's move that up a little bit. Again, like I said, I'm not worrying about perfect anatomy, but I'm probably worrying a bit more about it because obviously I'm recording it. Whereas if it was just doing it for me, I'd fix that stuff a lot later. Let's say that's probably good enough, right? I just want to check, flipping my canvas backwards and forwards, that it's working about right. Let's see, let's make the sleeve a bit more interesting. Yeah, so unfortunately this process might not be the most interesting one to watch because I'm kind of, you know, trying to think and do this at the same time, which is why you kind of want to be doing your design work. It's really when you're freshest, maybe in the morning or whatever it is, like first thing. If you can, obviously you won't always have the choice, but it's just somewhere where you kind of got your freshest and, you know, you can think quite clearly and not worry too much about what's going on around you. Well, now I really am babbling, aren't I? Okay, so let's just leave it there for the time being. Right, okay, so now the next stage is to refine some of these elements. So this is my basic shape, and if you remember, kind of talked about it a little bit before, but with your thumbnail designs, whether or not you do your designs with the painting method, or you do more like line work method, or, you know, any other method you can do graphic shapes, you can do selections and fills, you can do anything at all. But what you're doing is you're working from big to small, right? So you want to have this idea where initially you're thinking about the big shapes, the big flow. So what I'm doing here is I'm only really thinking about the big shapes. I haven't really looked at any of the design elements in here, like all the decor that I could put into this stuff, maybe having a sash or, you know, whatever it might be. This stuff, that's kind of secondary to my initial basic shape. So what I've got is the flow that I want, the basic stance that I want, and this idea of the sleeve. So they kind of flare out a little bit, and I've got something at the bottom. I can either have him wearing gloves, or I can have him wearing some of these things down here. Okay, so next stage will just be to turn this down on the opacity, and I'm just going to draw above it. I haven't quite gone, I know we've covered some stuff in environments as well, I haven't quite gone as loose as we've done initially in some of the environment stuff, but that might be because I've been drawing a little bit longer. I don't necessarily feel like I need to. Not that it's wrong or right, or, you know, you get to make your own choices on that. As you kind of progress through your for your journey, you'll start to understand what you work and how you work best, and that's honestly is the best way to do it. You know, we can teach you so much, only so much about sort of process and design, but ultimately you need to figure out the way it works for you, because it's not going to work the same way for you as it does for me. There are some things, certain things like designing from big to small, that kind of, well, I mean, maybe you can find a way of making that work, but I haven't really met anyone that's ever managed to make that work properly. If you do find anyone, just point them out to me. It'd be interesting to see that sort of as a process. Or any artists on YouTube, or famous favorite concept artist of yours that does it, I'd be interested to see it, because again, I've not seen it. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I haven't seen it myself. So at this point, this is where I'm starting to think a little bit about the details now. I'm starting to think a little bit more about the design, the distribution of shapes, your big, medium and small stuff, all that stuff that comes from, we've done in a little bit in environments, and we've done a little bit with the characters as well. Starting to think a little bit about that stuff. I think that's probably still a little bit too high, so I'll turn it down a little bit more. Don't want it to distract me too much, it's only there as a base. So what I know I've got these sort of tie things, so he's going to maybe have something here. That could give him some interesting flow. I'm trying to think about what would move as he moves as well, make his character a bit more interesting. Let's think about his pistol. I'm not going to design his pistol here. I'll talk about that in a minute, but I would probably do that separately. You know, whether or not I want this to be a flintlock or wheel lock pistol, or if I want it to be a revolver, depending on, you know, where I want to place it in sort of time period. Kind of stuff, or just again cultural context, because if I'm making this as a fantasy RPG, so in lots of ways we've got freedom to make those choices ourselves. We don't have to be tied by real world historical sort of references, but it can be useful to do that a little bit. Think about where and not in how technologically advanced they are as a not people, but like as a culture, I suppose. And whether or not the guy who's got more money can maybe buy a revolver, maybe it's one of like an early revolver, and everyone else has flintlock pistols, which makes him obviously more dangerous because of his technology, not necessarily because of his physical prowess or anything like that. That's just a way you can maybe get that kind of stuff in. And I'm going to try give him sort of he's got a funky looking foot right now. Trying to give him like maybe a half boot or something I haven't done yet. So maybe he's got these sort of things, but the boots are a little bit more. There isn't really a half boot here, but something a little bit more like that. So I'm trying to think a little bit about how it would fasten, how it change the shape of his foot. Quite like this as opposed to just the walking pose, because it kind of shows off enough of the front to give me an idea what they're doing. Now, what I like to do is think a little bit about the construction of the jacket itself. Maybe I want to give it some sort of... I'm sure this has a name. I forget the name of it now. The thing that folds over. Maybe it has to have one of those. But, again, rather than putting it at the top, which is kind of very classic jacket thing, I'm sort of just twisting the design. I'm taking elements and mixing them together. So maybe put that down the bottom here. So maybe it's down here in a sense of just to make something interesting, right? So maybe there's a thing that ties there and the jacket actually flaps round at the bottom. And it feels different. It feels like something you maybe haven't seen as much, but it's not particularly different. All I've taken is that shape and dropped it at the bottom. It's a pretty cheap way of making something new, but it's a very effective way of making something new as well. There's no point reinventing the wheel, especially if you're designing something that's got to fit in with a particular historical context or something like that. You can't really stray too far, otherwise people won't understand it as much. Okay, so I'm going to shut up for a little bit and just sort of try and detail some of these areas in. So again, I'm thinking about where my reed would be, or where my details might sit into. I'm actually probably coming to the end of this refined, quote-unquote, line work, which is still very basic. Maybe I could have something here that would help the belt buckle there. Don't know if you want some ammo pouches or something on the side here. Maybe he's got a small knife. All those things that actually, no, that interrupts the... This is where we're thinking about silhouette, right? So that interrupts the silhouette of it too much. So maybe if I want him to have a knife, I'd maybe want to place it somewhere else, maybe alongside the thing here. That could be a place for him to put it, easily reachable. That might start to cluster up that area, so maybe it'd be better on the back. That's where considering your silhouette does come in, even though I haven't designed it necessarily from a silhouette itself. Okay, so the next stage that I would go into is actually merging these two layers, dropping them down onto one, and I'm just going to quickly clean up some of this line work around the edge. Actually, probably should have done that before I merged them onto a single layer, but never mind. Alright. Okay, so now I've got a basic idea of where I want to go with the guy. I can now just drop a layer underneath, and this is where I start to consider the graphic read thing again. So I know we spoke about this in relation to the painting, but the graphic read is a really important thing to consider when you're doing your character designs, right? Because ultimately, if you remember what we said about value, value is more important than colour in lots of ways, because every single colour has an underlying value to it. So what I'm thinking about here is not about the colour. I can change the colour later. If you remember when I did the quick colour iteration demo, when I was, you can go back and look at that if I think I put it up. But about like making selections of value and then changing them using colour sliders or fill layers and stuff like that to actually create quick colour iterations. I am still thinking about the base value, so maybe I want to have lighter trousers and a dark jacket. So I'm again looking a little bit more at this rather than these, although I'm taking a lot from this sort of style. I'm thinking more about this kind of distribution of value. Maybe I'm going to keep them... Actually, maybe I'll make them darker because that's not something we've got in our references. So it might be something a little bit different than we're used to seeing. I'm going to make the jacket darkish. Now, maybe we want to make the... whatever these things are, these little decorative turnout bits. Now I'm sure once I finish recording this I will remember the name of it and I wonder why I didn't remember it when I was actually doing this stuff. But hey ho. For now, we'll just call it decorative turnout bits because I can't remember anything else. Okay, so let's just block this stuff in a little bit. Sorry, there's not much interesting stuff about colouring and flat value. I could probably make a selection and do it a bit quicker, but hey. So maybe I want to make the jacket, inside jacket, which I probably should have done before I did this, darker, like that one. And then maybe the one underneath it is the same value as the jacket. I'm looking for the distribution, like a cool distribution of shapes. Does that work or not? Yeah, that'll do. So I'm looking at this, so these things have been the same colour and the trousers being the same colour, but I also want the trousers to be different because of there. But there are slightly lighter waistcoats there as well, which makes something interesting. Let's go for, let's see, make the boots darker. Like this. And let's go for, keep it sort of a little bit more traditional and have some lighter things down there. So what I've started to build up is just a basic idea of the graphic read of the character. But I get to a point where, you know, this will do, this gives me an idea of it. But now I'm going to start painting on top of the line work, because I want to kind of get rid of the line work and just start thinking about some of the decor, because we have lots of different decor on these, and they're either light or dark, depending on how light or dark the jacket is. So if I was doing a jacket that was like a lighter colour like this, the details would be darker, but because I'm doing a darker jacket, I'm actually going to go for a lighter colour. I'm going to start thinking about how these things might be decorated like this. Actually, before I do that, I don't like the fact that these turnouts, these bits that I can't remember the name of, are the same colour. So I actually want to make them a different colour. So let's actually make them darker. So you've got a similar sort of... No, let's not do that. Or should we make them significantly darker? Yeah, let's make them significantly darker. So it's almost like the inside of his jacket is like a deep black or blue velvet, which would mean this would also need to be there because it's going to be the same material. Need to be a bit careful about, obviously, ruining the read of the character whilst it's just in the thumbnail stage. Yeah, something like that. I haven't actually detailed this stuff in there as well. Just some basic stuff like that. Yeah, okay. So now I'm going on the top and I'm starting to think a little bit about where I want decor. So I want this to be decorated a little bit like these jackets here. I want some sort of, you know, decor like this. But I also want this thing detailed. I maybe want the seams to change up because that just feels a little bit different to what we've got here. I haven't got anything else that looks like that yet, and I just kind of like the idea of this seam being different as well. So maybe there's some sort of decor that goes either side of it. Because I'm still in thumbnail stage, I'm not looking to refine all of these details just yet. So now I think about what's going to tie these. Maybe they've got buttons here that ties them back. Then around the base of the coat. Some on the jacket. Just to kind of break up these shapes, really. And anywhere I think that the decor would be nice. Now, this isn't going to work for every single character because of the fact that you kind of need a decent graphic read for a lot of this for this to work. But it can be a nice way of blocking them out. Again, depending on what kind of character you're doing, it works really well for this particular kind of character. When I was showing you more sort of, I guess, monstery kind of creatures, the painting method worked a little bit better. But for these ones, these work quite well. So I actually want to add some of this kind of ruffled thing here, whatever you call it, ruffs, I guess, cravats, I don't know. I really need to learn names of things before I try to start these videos. Okay, you say something like that, and honestly, that's kind of to the level that I take it, because I mean, obviously, it's going to take a little bit longer because I'm talking about it, but you don't want these things to take too long because remember, your thumbnails are throwaway. Really, really throwaway. You want them to. You don't want to be in love with the idea, because if you're in love with the idea, when somebody comes and says, you know, and they will, you know, whether it's client, art director, whoever it might be, will come and say no, and that's kind of their job to come say no, and there's going to be no for aesthetic reasons, there's going to be no for technical reasons, there's going to be no for narrative reasons. There's going to be lots of reasons that your design could be a no. And you want to have a bunch of ideas, because that also gets a starting point for conversation as well, which is an important thing. So let's just put this guy over here into a group so I can turn him off. Like this. So yeah, none of these really took too long. But then what I did from this point of view then is going, okay, well, what elements do I like? And you can start to see that, you can almost see, and if I turn it around so it kind of reads left to right, you can almost see the progression of the ideas coming through. So kind of did all these and got to this one. I kind of liked some of the elements in there, so I started to refine them a little bit, drag in other elements from the jackets that I like and sort of combine them to make new ideas. And then I went into this and I started refining them even further. So from this sheet, I liked this kind of idea. I liked this sort of longer jacket. So I combined all the stuff that I liked from the initial set of thumbnails into these ones here, and ultimately picked one that I liked the most of, and then started thinking a little bit about how the back looks. And this is kind of, again, it's a starting point for designing a little bit more about it. So that's kind of like your step-by-step refinement into this, but this is by no means the final iteration, the final design. It's not like I don't need to do any more design. I can start painting this thing up now, because I need to think a little bit about, it gives me some key elements to actually do further design work on. So I know he needs to have a gun, and I know this gun needs to be probably quite intricate to go with him as a character. It needs to be very personalized. Remember, weapons are never just weapons, especially, you start looking into some really interesting weaponry. And I definitely recommend you go have a look. Let's see if I can really quickly pull some up out of one of my texture packs. Antique firearms. Really good one. I recommend going to photobash.org and having a look at some of these, because this is where I got this texture pack from. Look at some of these as far as designs go for weapons when it loads. All these kind of handles, really interesting shapes in there. For barrels, for levers, for pulleys, things like that. They're never just, a singular gun. It's not just, you can't just draw a basic revolver and that'll be good enough, especially if it's a weapon that somebody has some pride in. Yeah, look at these. I mean, just the amount of detail that goes into them can be quite stunning. So, having those kind of designs into your weapon can be really good. I also know that I've got maybe some elements with the boots that need to be pulled out. So I've got some interesting things here that I just kind of scribbled in. But those could be either metal, they could be different kind of material. They could be just a lighter leather. But I kind of like the idea that maybe down the back here he's got some metal heels to it, and maybe some sort of metal decor on the toe of the boot. So now the boot needs designing. Glove, maybe, I don't know, the glove probably doesn't have too much stuff in it. This is kind of refined a little bit, but he's obviously got some sort of symbol here, so I need to understand what the symbol is here. Right, so these are all my questions that I'm asking myself. Again, here, is this going to be the same symbol as there? Is it going to be a different symbol? If he's the sort of faction leader that I'm thinking about, maybe that can be some sort of rank, or the logo for his particular organization. His holster here, that might need designing, because again, if he's got a signature weapon that's he's going to probably have a signature holster to go into, and various other things like that. Are these particularly different, or are they just going to be some sort of basic decor? It's not really that important to the character. What about this? Is he going to have different clasps? Because sometimes if you have like a decorated clasp, if you think of belt buckles that people wear now, they can have like logos or skulls or whatever they might be. You could have the same thing on the back of the character as well. And it's also depend a little bit on what kind of game or film, or if it's for a narrative thing, particularly boots. If it's for a narrative thing, we tend to neglect doing footwear because it's just not as interesting. But if you think about it from a narrative point of view, how often have you seen that? That thing about that classic shot. Guy gets out of a car. Now, he probably wouldn't get out of a car, but guy gets out of a car and you get the boot just like pops up on screen, right? It's just, the shot is just the shoe like this as he gets out the car. Now, if you've got a shoe that's like very intricate or very unique to this character, maybe it has some symbolism on it, has a one of his logos or something else that is present in outside of the character, you might immediately think that's that character. From a narrative point of view, that's him. That's just one example of it, but you think about that from every different point of view. Like how do you need to recognize this character? How quickly do you need to recognize this character? And that sort of stuff. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how to approach your character designs a little bit. Hopefully it wasn't too boring to watch. But just to think about that refinement, going through that process of going from big shapes, just basic rough designs, to small shapes. And the same thing goes for, it's not just character design, same thing goes for your environment design stuff when you're doing your 16th century building. Don't be too precious about it. So all of these designs here, they might work from a distance, but if I start zooming into them, they're really scrappy. I'm not looking for good artwork in any way, shape or form. It's not supposed to be pretty. It's not supposed to be really presentable. It's just really quick sketches. And the same thing goes for just like doing house sketches. So this is a quick sheet of house sketches that I did based around the same sort of brief. And again, you look at these, they're horrible. They're just really quick sketches. There's no detail in them. They've got basic forms. They're just scribbling on them, really. But the idea is, obviously, once you zoom out, they kind of come together and you get a basic idea for the shape of them and the silhouette of the houses. And again, you can kind of see the process I went through with iteration. So I started off here, just basic idea. And this is why usually your first idea is your worst, unless it's a subject that you're very well versed in, because you kind of do the one that everybody thinks of, and it's a little bit dull and a little bit boring. Then as you start to go on, you get a few different ideas, changing the shape of it, going for something different, and I can start combining those ideas, again, in my mind, not necessarily purposefully, but I get bits that I like. I mean, that's very boring as well. Let's start to get this. And this is where I start to go, I actually like some of these shapes. I like some of these building shapes. I like some of these proportion shapes. And you start pushing them a little bit further, then going with the idea of having the end kind of all rickety. And then kind of taking some of these ideas and doing that elastic banding thing where you kind of push the ideas a little bit further. And that's the same thing I went through with this character, right? Elastic banded in a way, to a fashion, should I say. When I did that, I combined a lot of the elements together. So now there's a lot of other stuff that needs to be designed on it, if I hadn't moved this around. But that is your basic idea. That's your basic idea for starting your character and thinking a little bit about the design of it. And don't just go for your basic elements. Think about how you can decorate them, particularly with characters like Gaspard, for example. I know he's supposed to be rugged and simplistic, but that doesn't need to mean boring. That can mean, patched. He could have some of his past life. He was, military in the past, so you think about that. Does he still wear his military uniforms? Does he still have his... Because military uniforms are generally quite hard wearing, so you could still have some of that stuff around. So yeah, hopefully that helps you a little bit, helps you direct it a little bit. Obviously I'm not going to go over this stuff in the sessions because we kind of have covered it a little bit before, but I just wanted to put it all somewhere where you can go back and watch it quite reliably. And I hope that helps a little bit, and happy designing with your characters. See you soon.